children were lined up in the cafeteria at Catholic school, and at the very beginning of the line, there was a large bowl with apples, and in very beautiful handwriting, a sister wrote, "Take only one, God is watching." And as the children went down the line, at the end of the line, they came to a large bowl of homemade chocolate chip cookies. And a sign was written in a child's scrawl that says, "Take as many as you want, God is watching the apples." You know, the important question is not whether or not God is watching, but how does God see us? You know, back in my home parish of St. John the Baptist, there was a painted image of the eye of God in a triangle, something similar over at Our Lady's shrine in the ceiling. And what struck me is that I was always uncomfortable with that image, thinking that God was watching all the bad things that I said and did and was not very happy with me. It was not until an older woman in the parish who noticed my uncomfortableness, she came up and explained to me that God is watching and he's seeing everything, even my sins, but he chooses to see me with the eyes of love so that I would see then the possibilities of his grace that would make me want to turn away from the darkness and the blindness of my own sins. You know, God has always wanted us to know that he sees us with the eyes of love, in order that we would then see the opportunities that his grace offers to us for forgiveness and healing. You know, the scriptures, give witness to this in the covenants that he made with the people of Israel. Even in the failures of the people to live up to the covenant, God chose not to abandon them, but raised up for them judges and prophets and kings in their midst, so that they would recognize that the false idols that they poured their hearts and their souls into were nothing but an empty void, and that their inhumane treatment of the poor and the powerless would simply just cripple themselves. Again and again, God wanted his people to know the power and the promise of his grace, his life-giving and loving presence, to help them to remember that he is seeing them with the eyes of love. You know, our faith tells us that God so loved the world in the fullness of time that he sent his only Son so that we would see the fullness of God's love. In the gift of his Son, God chose to set in motion the opportunities and the possibilities of his grace so that sin and death might not reign over us. Christ came not to condemn the world, but to save it through the ultimate sacrifice of the cross. You know, in the sacraments that we celebrate, we do encounter God's promise of love through Jesus Christ, especially in the Eucharist that we receive. In the sacramentals that you will pray with, that you might wear, that you will hold in your hands, we remember that they are simply a symbol of God seeing us with the eyes of love, so that our hearts and souls would then reflect back with a faith and a confident hope and trust that love he freely gives to us. A love that really is calling our hearts and our minds and our souls to become his. And down through the centuries, since Christ was with us in physical human form, God has sent those whose souls and hearts and eyes reflected his love time and time again. Numerous encounters and visions of the appearance of the risen Lord, the Blessed Mother, the saints, and they have been gifting us by God's love, calling us to remember this God who does choose to see us with those eyes of love. You know, this day at the shrine, we choose to remember and celebrate one of those appearances of our Blessed Mother, who some 760 years ago on July 16th, 1251, Our Lady of Mount Carmel appeared to St. Simon Stock. And so with the Carmelite order and the worldwide family that holds that spirituality as theirs, we come then here on perhaps the first day of their novena, recognizing the eyes of love that God gazed upon the Blessed Mother, and of which then she allowed St. Simon and his order to recognize that love through the offering of a scapular. You know, if we gaze into Mary's soul, we will see a perfect model of the interior life of prayer and virtue. We are going to see in her as one who is going to point us to Christ, her Son, as Father Gabriel de Pazzi, a Carmelite author, wrote. And he also said that in her soul, we too shall glimpse an uninterrupted oblation to God, continual contact and intimate union with Him that led her to have a total love and zeal for the Lord and for the salvation of us, the human family. When we allow then ourselves to see as Our Lady of Mount Carmel did, with the eyes of God's love upon her, we too should have a desire to have a closeness with God and make of our lives then an offering to God who loves us and gave us His Son as a perfect gift. When we allow ourselves to remember that God sees us with the eyes of love, as He did so many others before us, the prophets, the saints, the Blessed Mother, then we too will want to encounter His grace, to live in His love, to be filled with a zeal for the Lord and the salvation of our brothers and sisters as the human family. You know, 40-some years ago, an older woman showed me this and helped me to change my understanding of how God watches and sees us. You know, if we remember then that God sees us with the eyes of love, with all of our gifts and all of our sins, then like the Blessed Mother, we would know then that our jobs as followers of Jesus is really not to see through people, but it is really to see them through this life into the next.